He's been in jail for the last 3.5 years. At 76, he's the oldest political prisoner, one of 1,800. I think in life you choose what you live for, and you choose what you fight for. And for my father, that was democracy and free press in Hong Kong.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. Press freedom has been in the headlines in recent weeks, especially after Julian Assange's case was resolved and he arrived a free man in Australia.
We're getting some breaking news now involving WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and a plea deal with the DOJ.
After 14 years in exile, Julian Assange is 3.5 hours away from arriving back in Australia.
How does it feel to be a free man, Mr. Assange?
Congratulations!
How do you feel about the sentence, sir?
Assange was being pursued by U.S. authorities for publishing confidential records supplied by former Army intel analyst Chelsea Manning. That happened back in 2010 and 2011.
This prosecution sets a dangerous precedent that should be of concern to journalists everywhere.
As Prime Minister, I have been very clear that regardless of what you think of his activities, Mr. Assange's case had dragged on for far too long.
I'm not here to make a statement about the morality or otherwise of WikiLeaks. What I can say is if it was your son or daughter, would you want the legislators in Australia to act on their behalf and to try and get them home?
Today, we're talking to some special guests about another place where press freedom is under siege, Hong Kong.
Hong Kong's legislature unanimously passed a new national security bill on Tuesday.
Cheerfully hyped here as a vital safeguard.
Critics say a new security law threatens to silence what's left of Hong Kong's pro-democracy voices at the behest of Beijing.
Amnesty International came out a short time ago calling this law a weapon of repression and that this was China's way to govern Hong Kong through fear from this point forward.
Jimmy Lai is a renowned pro-democracy campaigner, media owner, writer and founder of Apple Daily. He's currently on trial in Hong Kong under the controversial new national security law, facing the possibility of a lifetime in prison. And he's already been imprisoned for 3 years. Joining me today is Sebastien Lai, Jimmy's son, to talk about his father's case and the situation in Hong Kong. G'day, Sebastien.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And joining him is Jennifer Robinson, Julian Assange's senior legal advisor and a counsel on this case as well. Thanks for joining us, Jen.
It's great to be back. Good to see you.
Sebastien, I want to begin with you. For people who aren't familiar with your father's case, can you just tell us a little bit about the charges that he's facing and what has happened to him?
Sure. So my father was the founder and publisher of the biggest newspaper in Hong Kong. More importantly, it was pro-democracy. So it was the loudest pro-democracy voice in Hong Kong. And so in 2020, when the national security law passed, they used that as a tool to imprison him, but also raid his newspaper. And so he's been in jail, as you mentioned, for the last 3.5 years. At 76, he's the oldest political prisoner, one of 1,800 people. And he's had multiple charges leveled against him, all of them politically motivated. I'll give you an example of one where he, for lighting a candle and saying a prayer at a Tiananmen Square vigil to commemorate the people who were massacred in Tiananmen Square in 1989, he got given more than a year in a maximum security prison in solitary confinement. So he's had a few of these politically motivated charges. He now stands trial for his national security law charge. And for that, he faces life imprisonment. But at his age, even if he gets 10 years, it's practically the same.
It would be in any case. You mentioned, this is part of the security laws, that he is a pro-democracy activist and has been for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about him as a person? He's your dad. Like, what has this been like for you and what kind of a person has your dad been throughout his life?
So my father was born in mainland China, and in 1947-48, and then the communists came, and so he escaped communist China when he was 12 years old and landed in Hong Kong. So even as a kid, he knew the differences between communist China and Hong Kong, which was a British colony at that point and had the rule of law and free press and freedom of speech. And as he tells it, the first day he lands, he had arrived on the bottom of a fishing boat, and obviously he owed money to smugglers, so he immediately went to work in a glove factory. But as he tells it, for him it was like he was in heaven, because he knew that in Hong Kong he had a future. So he kept working his way up society, in the business field, and he eventually founded Giordano, which I think is in Australia. And it was growing incredibly quickly. He was one of the success stories of Hong Kong. And then the crackdowns on the democratic protests in Tiananmen Square happened in 1989. And I think my dad had a political awakening as a result of that. I think he realized that though, by the dictionary books, he was self-made. He became fully aware that he wouldn't have had the life he had. He wouldn't have had the opportunities he had if it wasn't for the freedoms that Hong Kong had. Freedoms that were fought for and fought for by many people before him. So he decided to throw his name in the hat, and he started a media group which had a very pro-democracy stance, and was a media group that didn't pander to the powerful, criticize the government, anti-corruption, and was really a thorn on the Chinese government side. Throughout the years, he's had many politically motivated attacks on him. He's had firebombs, he had death threats. There was one time when someone skinned a dog and pinned it on his door, obviously because he offended mobsters as well as corrupt politicians. But he was never afraid. And I think growing up as a kid, that was one thing that I always remember, that dad was never afraid, or at least he never showed it. But when Beijing implemented the national security law in Hong Kong, they used that as a means to attack him and to arrest him, and then to raid his newspaper with 500 police officers. And so, as we mentioned before, he's been in jail since the end of 2020, and some of his colleagues have also unfortunately been arrested. Journalists.
Journalists around the world are being targeted as authoritarian governments try to tighten their grip on the media.
Media freedom is under siege.
Today, media organisations across the country have blanked out their front pages in a united stand against government secrecy.
When you report fake news, which CNN does a lot, you are the enemy of the people.
A cycle of fear is diminishing press freedoms around the world.
Now, the number of jailed journalists has increased.
Reporters Without Borders released its 2023 index, which now ranks China alongside North Korea as the world's least safe places for journalists. It's the first time China has ranked so low.
Jennifer, I want to come to you next to talk about some of these legal implications. Obviously, we're talking about the national security law that was introduced in 2020. Jimmy Lai, one of, as we were talking about, many people imprisoned as a result of that. But in particular, this has implications, obviously, for freedom of the press as a media proprietor and owner. Can you talk to me about some of those principles at stake here and why this case is so important, not just for Jimmy Lai, but for press freedom?
Absolutely. So I just want to first say that Jimmy Lai's is a remarkable story, as you heard from Sebastien, to go from, a child labourer to one of the most successful businessmen in Hong Kong, to have built a business empire the way he did, and to put his resources and his liberty on the line to speak truth to power to Beijing. He's a remarkable person who I'm so pleased that more people in Australia are now learning about. This has massive implications for freedom of speech. So if you look at the way the national security law is being wielded and weaponised to stifle dissent in Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai's case is emblematic of this crackdown on freedoms and crackdown on free speech. So if you look at the prosecution case, he's on trial right now in Hong Kong. He faces the rest of his life in prison because of his work with Apple Daily. And so the kinds of allegations that are being made against him, so foreign collusion under the national security law, the allegations they're making against him to reach a conviction in this case for foreign collusion include briefing members of parliament, including in Australia, reaching out to members of parliament here, reaching out to members of Congress to brief them about democracy and human rights issues in Hong Kong, speaking to international human rights organisations about human rights issues in Hong Kong, commissioning an editorial from the former governor of Hong Kong. So as editor and proprietor of Apple Daily, commissioning an op-ed on a matter of public interest in Hong Kong is what he's being prosecuted for under the national security law. That's how serious it is and how broadly worded the national security laws are. But it is emblematic of a broader crackdown. So we've also seen, and this has implications for Australia as well, there's an Australian citizen who was just among the 14 that were convicted in Hong Kong under the national security law as a pro-democracy campaigner. We also need to acknowledge that the long arm of China's transnational repression that has implications for the Hong Kong community here in Australia. We've had 2 Australian residents, one a resident, one a citizen, have bounties put on their head by the Hong Kong authorities and been described as rats who need to be hunted down. This is just because they are here in Australia exercising the freedoms that we have here, the freedoms that Hong Kongers used to have to speak out about democracy and free speech in Hong Kong. So this is not just about Jimmy Lai. His case is in and of itself incredibly important because of who he is and what he's done, but what his case says to the rest of the world about Hong Kong and what it means for others, both inside and outside of Hong Kong.
Yeah, and I want to stick with, I guess, some of the legal implications for this because, as you've said, a lot of countries are looking on to these developments with a great deal of concern. And one of the things I've seen coverage of is foreign judges withdrawing from the Hong Kong legal system. And I understand there's still some Australian judges who are serving there. For people who are unfamiliar with that, can you just give us a little bit of context about what is happening in that space and is that linked directly to these security laws and the way that China is enforcing them?
Well, the first thing to say is that foreign judges have long sat in the appeal courts in Hong Kong, but they do not sit in national security cases. In Jimmy's case and in cases under the national security law, there are only certain hand-picked judges that are permitted to hear these cases because, of course, foreign judges couldn't be controlled in that way. And so there's a fundamental problem with the independence of the judges who are sitting in these national security cases. But then there's a broader issue that I think people need to understand of what it signals to have foreign judges, to have Australian judges sitting in Hong Kong. Now, Jim Spiegelman was one of the first of the Australian judges to withdraw, and he chose to withdraw the moment that Beijing implemented the national security law and the extradition law, because from his point of view, that was the signal of the breakdown of the rule of law and the one state, two systems setup that was expected of Hong Kong becoming part of China. And so he was out early, but we've seen increasingly more and more international judges stepping away because they don't want to be seen to be giving a fig leaf to the rule of law in Hong Kong. And I understand that view. Now, of course, the judges who have chosen to remain have grappled with their own conscience and some say, well, it's important that we still sit there and the Court of Appeal is an important bulwark against some of these freedom of expression and freedom of association issues. But on national security cases, like Jimmy Lai's, no foreign judges will be allowed to sit.
Sebastien, do you have any thoughts on that? Because it seems to me, there's two sides of that. Either foreign judges are leaving because of the concerns around the rule of law and how it's operating there. But then I guess if they all leave left with a very compromised system, is that more or less just removing the fig leaf, as Jennifer has said? Is that an important part of how the international community can reckon really with this crackdown from China?
In order to answer that question, we have to ask ourselves a very, very basic question of, has foreign judges being in the Hong Kong system stopped it from being compromised? Now, since the passing of the national security law, Hong Kong went from having dozens of political prisoners to 1,841, as of the last counting. That's a 7,000% increase. That puts Hong Kong with the likes of Myanmar, while these foreign judges have been sitting in Hong Kong. Now, it's a very clear example of how the foreign judges haven't protected the integrity of the system. In some sense, you could say that their reputation has been victim to this fast changing of the Hong Kong legal system. And then we look at why these people are in prison. These people are in prison for, cases like my father, where he decided to stay and protect his journalists because he believed that he needed to stand up for liberty, for the free press, for democracy. And then you have cases where people attended protests, pro-democracy protests, peacefully. The 1,800 political prisoners in Hong Kong are there because of their beliefs that a person deserves freedom, deserves democracy. That is also a position that I would hope that the foreign judges hold, being from countries that have democracy. So you are, in this Hong Kong legal system now, you are essentially getting imprisoned for all expressions of democracy. And so the foreign judges that are still sitting have not done their role, haven't been able to do their role. And so I believe it is to the benefit to no longer put a stamp of approval on the system by being there.
Mm. So you've been campaigning on your father's behalf, obviously, because he's been imprisoned. Can I ask what the kind of reception has been to this, where you are advocating on behalf of your father? Are people aware and engaged in this issue, whether legally or otherwise? What's the reception been like?
Yeah, I've been incredibly moved by all the support that we've been getting, but from civil society, but also from states. Many governments have called for his release, including the United States government, the United Kingdom government, both houses of the Canadian Parliament, the European Parliament, multiple UN special rapporteurs, as well as many civil society groups and human rights groups. So I think people see it for what it is. They see it as a man who sacrificed everything he had to stand up for the liberty that we share and love in the free world. And I think with more support and more people hearing his story, we'll get him out.
Yeah. And how long has it been since you've seen your father?
So I haven't seen him since his arrest. So I haven't seen him for more than 3.5 years.
I'm really sorry. That must be really difficult. And how's this impacted on you as well? Now, you advocating on your father's behalf, I presume that's had implications for you as well.
Yeah, it has. Obviously, it means that I have to travel all the time, tell this story that isn't necessarily the most comfortable one to tell. But I think in life, you choose what you live for, and you choose what you fight for. And my father, that was democracy and free press in Hong Kong. And for me, fighting for my father is something that I'm happy to do, and I'm glad that I can do.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today to tell us so much about your father and this case. Jennifer, obviously this is another high-profile case involving press freedom that you've been involved in. We've seen the recent release of Julian Assange. I guess, you've been involved in these high-profile cases around press freedom. Does Julian's release with the plea deal, should that give hope to democracy campaigners in Hong Kong and people fighting for press freedom around the world?
I really hope it does, and I really hope it does for Sebastien too. I'd love to have a day like we had with Stella Assange on the tarmac the other night, being reunited with Julian and then later with the kids. I want that for Sebastien. And if we can negotiate the release of Julian Assange in respect of one of the most powerful countries in the world, the US, which was a seemingly intractable case, and many people thought he'd spend the rest of his life in prison, that it was impossible, and we kept going and we got there. And it was a combination of public legal advocacy, litigation, and campaigning, the kind of campaigning you're seeing Sebastien do for his father. The difference for Sebastien is, of course, that now because of his campaigning, he can't go home to Hong Kong. And the transnational repression that we're seeing from China towards him, being threatened with criminal offences for speaking out on behalf of his father, us being accused of criminal offences for speaking out at the UN, doing this kind of advocacy, that's what sets China apart, which is this extension of repression across borders. But I do think that what we've just been able to achieve with Julian Assange, I hope it does give hope. It certainly gives me hope. And let's get Jimmy Lai out next.
Absolutely. And so what does that look like in Jimmy's case in particular? What happens with the legal proceedings from here on out?
Well, we expect the trial to continue for many more months. We don't believe there'll be any other outcome than a conviction because of the broad nature of the way the national security laws are drafted and the way the case is being run. We are trying to get as many countries as possible to call for his release. The US and the UK have already done so. UN experts have done so. A group of 5 UN experts have done so, and we're going to continue our advocacy at the UN. Both houses of Canadian Parliament, the European Parliament. We're now doing briefings here in the Australian Parliament, and I have to say I've been really touched and proud that so many Australian members of Parliament from across the political spectrum, like we had in Julian's case, are beginning to come together to support Jimmy, and you'll see more and more, I hope, of the impact of our advocacy this week in days to come. But to me, we need the international community to put pressure on China. This is about increasing the political cost to their ongoing unlawful and arbitrary detention of Jimmy Lai. And I hope that if we can resolve this case, and it will give hope to others in Hong Kong, because this case is emblematic of the crackdown on civil liberties there.
And Sebastien, I'll finish up with you. If people want to help out with your father's campaign, whether they're Australian members of Parliament or Australian members of the public, how can people help?
So you could follow the story along at Support Jimmy Lai, or you could write to your representative. My father, for the last 30 years, has defended and campaigned for, I guess the good stuff, right? Stuff that as members of its democratic nation, we all know and love. And sometimes we forget that though we live in a democracy and we are protected as a citizen of this democracy, it is also our responsibility to speak out for the good stuff. And so I wish that people join in calling for my father's release and write to their representatives for them to do so as well, because that is all the hope of having that is what the people of Hong Kong campaigned for.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and best of luck, and I hope you see your dad again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Jennifer Robinson and Sebastien Lai for joining us on the podcast today. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.